Okay, good morning. This is my exposition for chapters 8 and 9 of the subject Teaching Pronunciation for the Master's degree in Teaching English from eXpro University. So chapters 8 and 9 are about teaching pronunciation, intonation, and the features that we need to take into account for this subject, for this aspect of teaching English. Now, I think that teaching pronunciation is one of the most difficult aspects of English in my classes. In my classes, I try to do a lot of repetition for my students so that they can get the pronunciation the best way they can, the closest to the right pronunciation. Although sometimes the students find this difficult because the sounds are not common in our language, in our native language, which is Spanish. There are some differences, so students can find it difficult. Now, talking about intonation, we can focus on the prosodic features, which are pitch, loudness, and length. These features are particularly special for intonation, and we can say about intonation, I can say that it's like the melody of the language. We use melody, stress, and rhythm. That's the way we speak. When we hear someone speaking another in a second language, we can usually know which their native language is because they keep features of their first language, like the rhythm or stress they use. Also, this makes it difficult to express themselves correctly in the second language, for example, English, which is the language we are talking about. So I'm going to give you some examples of how to do some exercises for intonation. English and Spanish are intonational languages. This means that we can use the pitch. We change the pitch, and this will change the meaning of the sentence. Not the meaning of the word. The words will keep the same meaning, but depending on the intonation we use, we change the meaning of a sentence. For instance, I have two examples here using tag endings, tag questions, using rising and falling intonation. When we use rising intonation in a tag ending question, is because we are asking for confirmation. We need the other person to confirm what we are asking. When we use falling information, it's because we are pretty sure or almost certain that the person did whatever we're saying. So for example, in this sentence, you've heard this song before, haven't you? Haven't you? I'm using rising intonation because I am not sure and I want the other person to tell me if they have or haven't heard the song. On the contrary, if I use a falling intonation, I would say, you've heard this song before, haven't you? It's because I'm certain that you have heard that song before. Talking about rising and falling intonation, we can use rising intonation mainly for questions and to ask for a response in English. Do you want to have breakfast? Rising intonation. Did you pick up the laundry room? Did you pick up the dry cleaners? Now, for falling intonation, we use mainly commands, instructions, orders, and we use it at the end of the list. For example, if I'm saying we need to go grocery shopping, we need eggs, milk, and bread. So that's falling intonation. Pick up your room. Can you close the window, open the door, close your book. So those are commands, and I am using falling intonation. So as you can see, intonation is an important feature of English when we are speaking. Now, another important feature is the tone unit. The tone unit refers to the word in a sentence that will be more emphasized. Now, for this, it's important to take into account the different type of words we have in English. We need to differentiate between content words and functional words. Content words, which are nouns, adjectives, verbs, adverbs, are the ones that carry the meaning in a sentence. As opposite to function words, which can be prepositions and articles, and they are not as important in a sentence because they don't carry the main meaning. Now, for example, in this sentence I've written here, depending on the word I stress, the meaning of the sentence will change. So we have the same sentence. I'm gonna try to read it as neutral as I can. I bought a red car last year. Now, for example, if I emphasize, I bought a red car last year, what I am trying to say is that the subject, which is I, is the most important information I need to carry on to my students. So nobody else bought it, I bought it. Now if I change this to emphasize, I bought a red car last year, what I want people to know is that I bought a car, not a bike, not a truck, not a bus, but a car. Or if I say, I bought a red car last year, then that means that I want to emphasize that I bought it last year, not this year, not 5 years ago, etc. So this is another, so the tone unit is important so that we can change or express the right meaning of our sentences. I mentioned that it's important to make differences between or differentiate the functional words again or versus content words. So in this same sentence, for example, if I say I bought a red car last year, there is a word that we can hardly hear when I say it, and it's this, because as an article, this is not an important word that is carrying any meaning. So I say, I bought a red car last year. And you can almost, or this sound almost disappears in the sentence. So that is also very important when teaching pronunciation to our students. Okay, now, entering the topic of, or within the topic of teaching pronunciation, we can take into account or use different procedural options, which can be exposure, exercise, and explanation. With the first one, exposure, what we try to do is just have our students be exposed to the language we want them to practice. We don't need to explain them, we just say the things. This is for a lot of repetition exercises. We just say, please repeat after me, and then they try to imitate the sound or the pronunciation we make. We assume that spoken language, this happens with spoken language as a need of communication, so students will acquire almost naturally, but I think they do need some practice. For exercise, this would be the traditional procedure that we use. This is when we identify a particular sound and then we ask our students to see it, to repeat it, and to practice it several times. But they already know what they are doing, and they already know what sound they're focusing on. And explanation, then we assume that we need to make students aware of phonetic and phonological facts so that students learn the correct pronunciation. So with explanation, we show them the phonemic chart and we teach them the sounds. Now, I'm going to talk about my particular experience. I have never used the whole chart in a class. I use it and I show it to my students, but I don't ask them to learn it. What we do is we use only the symbols that are troublesome for us, for Spanish speakers. So we focus on the pair of symbols. We do a lot of minimal pair work to identify different sounds so students can practice and differentiate the sounds when they hear them and they are able to read and pronounce them correctly. So I do use the chart, but in a very limited form. I don't ask them to like memorize a whole set of sounds, but we just use them with the sounds that are in the vocabulary we're learning, for example, and to differentiate these sounds. Okay, so now about teaching pronunciation, I don't specifically have a class for teaching pronunciation in actually the school where I work, which is normal. We don't have this type of lessons. We don't focus on pronunciation. It's more like teaching the didactics of teaching English. But when we come across some sounds that are difficult, then I stop and I make a lesson for that, to practice those particular sounds. Now, as we know, we can divide the teaching of pronunciation in two big sections, which would be focusing on the segmental features, which are identifying sounds of consonants, vowels, within the consonants, identifying which ones are voiced and voiceless, vowels, single diphthongs, and single when they are short or long. But it's also very important to focus on the suprasegmental features of pronunciation, which is intonation, stress accent, and connected speech. So here I have two examples of exercises I do with my students to try and teach this feature. The first exercise, which is sound reduction, would be aiming to suprasegmental features of pronunciation, and I like to use the going to future form a lot because it shows the students how these sounds can be reduced, how we can use connected speech, and how they need to, if not use it, at least identify it. Now, I wrote this example. The first example, as you can see, it's written in the complete form. Now, I always tell my students, if you say it just like that, it's perfectly correct. I am going to get a book. It's perfectly correct, but it's not so natural. So in order to sound more natural as speakers of a second language, we need to learn some of these suprasegmental features, like how to reduce a sound. Now the second one, it's also pretty normal. We're just using the contracted form of the verb to be. Here, in I'm going to get a book, or I'm going to get a book. I'm going to get a book. That's perfectly pronounced, but again, it's not as natural as if I shorten it a little more and I say, I'm going to get a book. So here we are even linking two sounds. And as I mentioned before, I'm not emphasizing the functional words, which would be to and a. I'm not going to get a book. I'm not going to get a book. Then I go to the next one. I'm gonna get a book. I'm gonna get a book. I'm gonna get a book. Now, I always explain to my students that you must never write it this way, but you can pronounce it this way, and the most important, you need to identify it when someone else says it. Finally, I've got this, which is the most informal form, and it would be, I'm gonna get a book. I'm gonna get a book. So we have reduced all this expression. I am going to just I'm, and then get a book. So finally we end up with just 3 content words, which are the most important. I, get, and book. And we reduced all the rest. I'm gonna get a book. So I have found that these kind of exercises help students a lot. I also recommend that they listen to songs and try to listen to songs while reading at the lyrics so they can identify how singers use this sound reduction. Okay, finally, I'm going to show another exercise I do a lot in class. It's about minimal pairs. As I mentioned before, I use a chart, the phonemic chart, only with troublesome sounds that students might find. For example, the short E. For that, I usually have the sounds in cards like this. First, we practice them isolated, like E, E, and I explain how one is short and the other is long. Then what we do is we have pairs of words that students need to identify and repeat. For example, lep, leap, lep, leap. Then students sometimes they get them all mixed and they have to identify which go with which sound. For example, slep, sleep, slep, sleep. Het, heat, het, heat. And so on. So students identify the sounds. Another example would be the sh and ch. Sh, ch. For Spanish, it's always easy to tell them to, this sound is easier to make because you tell them to make as if they are shushing someone, like shh, this sound. And then this, we have it in Spanish, so we don't have a problem with this. For example, we ask them to pronounce ship and chip, ship and chip. So these are some of the sounds, some of the exercises I do with my students in class. Sometimes they find it, at first they find it difficult to see the signs and to identify which are which, but with practice they can master it and they can improve their pronunciation. So that would be all for my teaching pronunciation class. I hope I have covered all the points required. Thanks for watching.